there's a chance to hybrid things too. We want to hear your input tonight, and that's what we want to show you this work when it's still kind of wet clay. It's not a done deal that we just give you a final report. Yeah. Just give you an FYI so you don't look at it. He said what? Y'all know? Right. We'll keep going with the scope. Yeah. And the ideas are pretty far along. I think what's interesting is we were doing the very detailed road research, road racing research, and it was fascinating to see just how little is being done around the country. I mean, our transportation guys can't find great precedents. There's a couple of projects in Maine. There's a couple of projects several in Florida that are at the design and planning stage, but haven't really, except for Miami Beach, has not gone into implementation. There's just precious little road racing stuff, except for rural, one or two culvert out in the middle of a marsh on a road race on a third beach in Middletown, kind of a thing. That's about it. Yeah. So it's fascinating. So coming up with those estimates has been really interesting because, we're looking at all the data we possibly can. And there's a range of costs, and I'll present it tonight as that range. We know that, exclusive of bridges, we're finding this is what's happening in the country. It's basically 2,500 to 5,000 per foot to adapt to elevate and adapt the road, plus adjacent utilities and stormwater. So, yeah, so we'll see if we get anybody from DOT attending. We'll see if who's going to be on. I love the way everybody's gotten so used to Zoom and people literally have 30 seconds on. It populates. Yeah. So I hope we get good audio. Yeah. You guys are ahead though, which is good. I mean, in terms of, Warren at least is in the planning process. There's a lot of communities who are thinking about this for different sources of federal funding, but haven't sort of done the, the sort of detailed work. Oh God, I'm glad I included that logo for statewide planning on my page. No, really, a lot of one of the key points is that this is built on really great work that we've been doing around the state for years and years and years. Not just you, CRMC, URI, UPenn, everybody. You can. You can adapt. That's what you can do. Hi, Perry. Kate, Erica.
Hello.
Let's see, can I change her status? No, apparently not. That just renames that. We're going to rename her now. That's not nice. Your phone. Yeah, absolutely. Yes, you can. Oh, the phone's at home. It's not at the office. You are, of course, welcome to do anything that works that way. There you go. Technology. How do we get out of here? Yeah. There you go. You have 3 minutes. Case? I forgot what kind it is. Apparently, I'm calling someone.
License plate can get you. Have somebody over the registry. A little bit of
Bob, have we exceeded your expectations already? Yes. Well, sorry to hear it. Leave that up in case we get it. Sure.
I was going to speak up. Thank you very much.
Fred. Yeah, he's kind of hosting, I think. Oh, and there we are.
You're really far away.
That's fair. They're not going to get a lot of detail on this. Yep. Okay, there we go. He can't. The connection for the laptop is sort of rooted over there. It can't. We were here yesterday just practicing the setup to make sure it would all work. So. Good. 9 participants.
I'll research my notes because they also wanted to change private beach there.
I'm ready. You ready?
So I think it's 7 o'clock. We're going to get started just before you. We just want to make sure that people that are participating on hear us. Anybody on Zoom, just raise your hand icon or send me a quick text message to say that you're here.
I'm sending a note to Erica just to ask her. Yep. Erica says she can hear us.
Okay, good. All right, so thank you all for coming. You don't know me, I don't know why. I'm Rob Woolley, I'm the Director of Planning and Community Development. This is our second workshop for the Market to Metacom initiative on climate resilience and economic development. This is being funded by the town as well as a SNAP grant, which is a portion of federal EPA. This is the first study of its kind that's ever been done by SNAP anywhere. Take a comprehensive look at resiliency, stormwater, as well as economic development. I don't know if you want to go to the next slide, that would be great. And what that would be better. So why are we doing this? Because climate change is a real thing. You're going to see tonight that even looking out 14 years to 2035, there are serious implications to what's going to happen here in Warren. Combination of sea level rise, stronger storms, more intense precipitation events. We've been, I think, on the forefront of communities within the state looking looking at resiliency and addressing climate change. For a number of years now, we were one of the first to participate in the municipal resilience plan. We are updating our hazard mitigation plan. We have worked with URI and UPenn.
Sorry, Bob, just getting some messages through that they can't hear you very clearly, so I'm not sure what mic you're on or if you can up the volume at all. We'll hear. Start talking again and we'll see.
So as I said, we've been addressing these issues for a number of years now. In addition to hazard mitigation, we did a pilot program with a demonstration project with the town of Barrington. We partnered with Barrington on the municipal resilience plan. We had a project with UPenn students, and now we've evolved into what we're working on now.
Erica says you seem quieter now. It's that your laptop is probably your mic. They can hear the audience and you beautifully, they said. Yeah. Try now. Talk.
Why don't we move that?
Yeah, let's do that.
We are learning hybrid meetings. Apologize if my back is to you. So this top picture is.
Yep. Do you want to try it from up here, Bob? Apparently it kicked out when you said the top picture. Just to test out there for folks, can you hear me in Zoom land now that I've turned this mic back on? Okay. I think Bob's going to next test his mic from over there. Bob, it shows you as unmuted, so you want to give it a shot? I'll do the test 1, 2, 3. Come on over here and let's see if you'll go. Yeah, so I think maybe you come over here and we'll go through this mic only. And I thought hybrid was going to be so easy.
No, I think we go to the next slide. So to date, we've been working with Russell O'Neill and Union Studios. We've done a significant amount of data collection with respect to parcels in each of these areas. And that's the size, the ownership, the occupancy. We have had one previous public workshop in the end of May. We've established the Market to Metacom website. Tonight, in the previous meeting, we looked at the future, which was available to do nothing. And then also, what if we looked at phase relocation and restoration? So tonight, we're going to dig a little bit deeper into the scenarios in terms of what the impacts are economically, as well as property loss, and then talk a little bit more in terms of where we're going with respect to the Metacom plan. And then in September, we will have a final report and presentation as to where things are.
The microphone on the computer might be directional.
Got it. So let's do a test. Can folks hear me? I think I'm coming out of that speaker as well. Okay, so that seems to work. Not Bob, I'm assuming he's the him, but you guys are getting it. Well, that's actually not bad because Paul and I are going to sort of do the rest of the presentation, and I will turn the laptop when we get to the question and answer section. That should cover us. All right. So for folks who were not at the existing conditions presentation in May, we want to do a very quick, I want to kill that speaker. We want to do a very quick run through, just a show of hands in the room who attended or watched the presentation that we gave in May 12th. So only about a quarter of the room. So I'm going to go through this quickly, but one thing I want to let folks know, you can go back and there's a lot of data in that presentation. You can go back and watch that online on the computer. So that's it's on the project website. It gives a deep dive into the existing conditions. I'm going to hit the high points that you need to know for us to discuss the scenarios that we're going to present for the Market Street area and Metacom Avenue corridor. So I'm going to start with Market Street, and basically, as you can see from the map, it's an area of about 184 acres, really runs from Belcher Cove on the north, and its tributaries that head out to the east, all the way south through Market Street, Cumulative Ave, Child Street, and down to Franklin Street, and it's bordered really by the bike path over on its west side, and the watershed on the east side. There's 400 buildings within this area. There's 700 housing units in this area, and there's a little more than 30 businesses in the zone. Land use, for everybody here in town who sort of knows it, it's a real mix. We've got below Child Street, sort of an industrial core. You've got a bit of a commercial corridor with Market and Child on the west-hand side, but primarily residential land use as you're on sort of the north and the east sides of the site. And we've broken that down into 4 percentages. Assessed value is about $138 million of real estate. That is both buildings and land.
586 parcels. Average value in there is about just for $200,000. And obviously some of those industrial, you can see from the color scaling, are assessed as much higher, whereas residential is pretty much even across the boards in terms of value. What does that generate for the town every year? About $2.4 million in your tax income comes from this area. So that's sort of what's on the line in terms of income production on an annual basis. And flood zone mapping, you've probably all seen this, this mapping. And basically the blue is the sort of deeper flood zone, the 100-year flood zone, and the 500-year flood zone, which goes beyond it, is shown in orange. And it covers a huge swath of the project area that we're looking at, which is outlined in yellow as well. Now, we want to switch over to looking at Metacom Avenue to understand the same kind of dynamics, what's happening in that area. We very much, when we defined this project area working with the town, we wanted to define it as the parcels that are either directly fronting on Metacom Avenue or are zoned commercially or some other use, but not looking at the single family residential neighborhoods behind. But we wanted to look at the land uses that either front the street or are already commercial. So we've got 81 acres in this zone, 54 buildings, really. Obviously, they're a little larger in footprint. 66 housing units are in this area, and about 50 businesses are in this zone. And the town's zoning really reflects that. It's a perimeter zoning, so you can see that pink stripe that comes down is the commercial zone, and then residential is behind. Some of the larger parcels that go back off to the east and west are both kinds of zoning because of the way they're divided. Assessed property value, total assessed value in this zone is $59 million. And it currently generates just over $1 million in annual taxes to the town in terms of income. One of the things that's important for this grant, this is from EPA expressly for looking at impacts to stormwater. And so we looked at the drainage infrastructure in both areas. For Metacom Avenue, it's really striking that everything really flows down that hill and goes down Metacom Avenue, flowing to the north. Some goes to Vernon Street and into that system, but most everything finds its way to the Kickaduet River. And we've done full volume studies to look at what happens. But the other thing that's important about that drainage infrastructure is that the development in this area took place before there were stringent requirements for on-site stormwater treatment. Most of this water simply flows across those parking lots, down into the storm system, into the street, and then flows to Kickaduet. Very little is treated on site. One example is Water Rower, more recent development that had to conform to DEM stormwater requirements. The good news on Metacom Avenue is you can see the flood zones. You all know the topography. It's on the top of the hill or on the upslope of the hill. So there to your right is the 100-year and 500-year flood zone where the land rises out of the Kickamuet. So it is safe from those immediate 100-year and 500-year flood events as defined by FEMA, Federal Emergency Management. In our prior presentation, Diane Moss, who was Chief Climate Resilience Officer at Fuss & O'Neill, gave a longer presentation showing projections within the area. And I'd urge you to watch that presentation if you really want to know the science behind this. I want to hit the high notes that Diane covered. And the key really is this sequential mapping where the colors kind of tell the story. High tide projections, so this is not storm event based, this is simply sea level rise based on NOAA data, National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration. And you can see in blue in 2035, the high tide floodwater is covering the marsh up off to the west of Belcher Cove, where the bridge is at 136, and it's beginning to come down that culvert system that runs down the seam at James Mills Park crossing Market. And so by 2035, Market is beginning to be covered every high tide. And then 2050, that trend continues as the water rises. 2070, deeper flooding, and it really has made its way across Child Street because that is a collecting watershed over there. And then 2100, there's a great deal of flooding in the area based on the NOAA projections for this zone. One of the things that we've done since the last meeting is to sort of look at this, not just in a map view, but to look at this across the buildings. So if you've been at Amarell's Fish and Chips and you're looking across the street, this is sort of what you see on Redmond Street. And so what we've highlighted here is that in 2035, there's about 6 inches of water at high tide above Market Street. But by 2050, we're looking at about 3 feet coming over the street at that lowest lying part down Redmond Street. And then as time progresses, that sea level rise change for each high tide is really coming in higher and higher on Redmond and up those buildings. Ellis Street, we wanted to look at a residential street that's a little further back, a little further north in the project area. And you'll see that that's a little bit higher on Market Street. So in 2035, the sea is still 1 foot below Market Street. Market Street is a bit high up here, so there's going to be some overflow or some rising up through the storm drain systems. So it's about 1 foot over Market Street by 2035. And that keeps going as time progresses to the point where this area is about 9 feet under at 2100 based on those NOAA projections. Now, the one thing that we plan for is not just sea level rise, but a 100-year coastal storm that takes place on top of that. And this mapping shows as well that when you have that additional water depth from that 100-year storm coming up, and that sort of storm-driven rain event, the kinds of water depths that can take place. And so this is in 2100, so it's obviously well in the future, but shows that those storm events will have a significant impact on the Market Street area. But the good news is Metacom, because of your topography, while there is some creepage in, is still high and dry. Looking at that area. Transportation assets are another thing that we're taking a deep look at. The state planning department, state planning program has done a great job looking at all of the endangered transportation systems. Obviously, local streets are an issue. These are Warren roads exposed to just plain sea level rise. And this is on the right-hand side showing the 100-year storm event as well with red. And really one of the key issues is regional connectivity for you and then evacuation routes. Moving people through in the case of events. So certainly Warren folks to be thinking about that, but you are a cross connector between Barrington, between Swansea, and down the peninsula down to Bristol. So you're at a key road hub where this impacts the region, not just Warren itself. And then one factor, we obviously are paying attention to the current regulations that are in place, and the flood insurance program, which is underwritten by the federal government, is key, and they are revising their maps and updating those. The most recent update is July 2014, and this shows the Market Street area, which is in the AE zone. Right now, if you were going to build something new, your base flood elevation would be above 13 feet above mean high water. So really, right about now, that's about 12 feet above Market Street if you were going to qualify for that program. And one key issue we always talk about is that we certainly plan for that 100-year flood zone, which is outlined here in red. But in addition, there's wave effects to bear in mind for certain places depending on the fetch of the wave. And so, what is construction like? What is flood preparation like within all those areas? One of the things we're also aware of, and you'll see it in some of the future scenarios, is that federal flood insurance is underwritten by the federal government. But there's a lot of debate going on right now about the cost of this to the federal government and who should be insured, what those rates should be, and how that insurance is calculated. And really, that's the legacy of Katrina and Sandy and Harvey and other large disaster events in the flood zones. And I think that will be a constant discussion that's a background for how Warren discusses this. Will that insurance program be there in the same way in the future? So having said that, that was the sort of summary of existing conditions, which paints the scenario in which there is change coming in the Market Street area, and certainly other areas of Warren, but for our focus, we're focused on the Market Street area for this project. So what I'd like to touch on is, okay, what does that mean for your possible courses of action? One thing I would say is that Warren is ahead of a lot of communities in that you've assessed the impacts that are going to come from climate change. With your hazard mitigation planning, your municipal resilience planning, all these studies that you've done, what this project is supposed to do is to begin to say, well, what are your possible paths to change? What are your possible courses of action that you might take? I want to highlight we're midway through our process for this, and we're doing conceptual level planning, order of magnitude. So this isn't exactly what the road is going to look like, exactly where sidewalks go, exactly how things adapt over time. It's to get a sense of how change might happen in different scenarios and get reactions to that from you, from town leaders. So what we've done is we have really, our focus has been on measurement of forecasted impacts, taking that data and saying, what does that mean on the ground? Quantifying those impacts, and we've been what we call sort of very pessimistic about that, which is We're looking at the highest cost we can look at based on known precedents that are taking place in other communities and have happened with other places. But those numbers are real, but we're applying those in the most sort of drastic way. And we're drafting these scenarios, and they are draft. And so we want to get reactions tonight because there can be hybrids and changes to these. You're going to see these and say, how do you feel about that reaction? And maybe it's a little different in this way. If you have that idea, that's what we're here to talk about. And this is a dynamic planning process. Tonight's not a final presentation where we say, here's what you must or should do. Instead, this is to get dialogue going. This is to get reactions as we head towards September, when we are looking to solidify some recommendations for how we go on. So I'm going to focus on the Market Street area, and Paul and his team are going to focus on the Metacom Avenue area when we show you these three scenarios. I do want to note one important thing for data for us. We part of this project is not doing new tide measurements. It's not getting out there and doing new work to predict what the level of climate change is going to be. We're building on the work of professionals and experts at different agencies who have already gathered this data, and we're applying it in terms of how you might change, what your reactions will be. So property and tax data from the town of Warren. Our GIS data comes from both the town and the state of Rhode Island, which has a great GIS system. Climate forecast data comes from the federal government agency for this, National Oceanographic and Atmospheric. We've been really blessed to have Storm Tools, which is a data tool that CRMC and URI have developed, which allows communities to predict storm impacts and sea level rise impacts. And disaster impact estimates of costs come from FEMA and Flood Factor, which is another good platform that's available to the public. And our road and bridge data comes from both statewide planning, Rhode Island Department of Transportation, and national data on how communities are adapting their roadways. So I think that that's an important thing to sort of let you know that where we're building our modeling on and our data. So for market, I'm going to talk about two alternative scenarios. If you do nothing, what happens? If the town takes no action, but you simply those events take place and you react over time, what are those impacts? If you do a scenario where you are doing a phased relocation and restoration, which means you're actively removing assets and people from the danger zone, relocating folks and allowing the chance for relocation over a long period of time, and restoring some of that area so that it is more resilient and can deal with those changes like increased flooding and tides, then what does that look like on the ground? And what does that look like even financially? So the no action scenario has these assumptions built into it. The town of Warren takes no actions to prepare. State agencies and utilities take no action to prepare. The events happen. Sea level rise per NOAA forecast takes place: 1 foot by 2035, 3 foot by 2050, 6 foot by 2070, and that we see an increase in frequency and severity to historical averages in precipitation and storm events we're seeing, and that takes place. So the costs that we're going to see when you talk about a no action scenario, some of which we have quantified, some of which we have not. Insurance losses to property owners and insurers. So if the building suffers damage, there's that loss. The loss of commercial buildings and what they contribute to the community. Displacement of particular businesses that are in those zones and suffer damage, and what the cost of lost operational days is when they're not up and running, they're not selling product, they're not making something. Environmental pollution and cleanup costs. There is a landfill at Jamie's Park. You have a lot of DEM registered sites through this area where there's storage tanks or some other substance. Municipal financial impacts. What's your lost tax revenue? What's your cost to repair and replace infrastructure if you want to keep it going as you go through these events? So I'm going to walk you through basically these four sort of time stops of the 2035, 2050, 2070, and 2100. And show you what those look like. And again, folks can also follow along at home. This is posted on the project website. If you're on Zoom, you can open this up in the project plan draft section. So on the left is always going to be just plain old sea level rise by 2035. And we've discussed those crossing Market Street and going up that culvert, coming over into Jamie Park and some of the houses that are on Belcher Cove, but along Market Street. And if a storm event comes on top of that, and that's a 100-year storm on top of that level of sea level rise, it obviously has an expanded impact through that drainage area into Belcher Cove. And you can see from those water depths, deep blue is the darkest blue, tends towards 20 feet of water depth. And as you head towards the very light shaded area, you're sort of at 0-1 feet as you're around that area. So really the entire project area in a 100-year storm in 2035 will be inundated except for a little island over here off of Child and Metacom. So what does that mean? How do we quantify that? Well, we went and turned these into phase areas, counted all our buildings and assets, and started doing some calculations. So the number of properties flooded in that 2035 scenario is, and this is the sea level rise scenario only, is 58 properties. Buildings themselves, so properties obviously is land and building. Buildings flooded is 31. Housing units lost, which will really no longer be functional unless they're elevated and the entire land under them is lifted up, is 57 housing units, and residents displaced is 86. With those buildings becoming non-functional under this model, there's a lost annual tax revenue of $200,000. And if those buildings are brought to be non-functional by daily flooding to the point where you can't use those assets, it's a loss of about $8 million in building loss costs, and that's borne out by insurance. It's it's spread out among those building owners and other agencies. So if there's sea level rise plus a 24-inch flood event that comes in, so thinking about just sort of like the 54 hurricane as a precedent for that, damage to those buildings in the zone based on that level of flooding across our project area is about 3.5 million. Lost business revenue if those businesses that we've mapped are out of business for an average of say 6 months because they flooded and have to replace walls and systems and electric and other systems. That's lost business costs. So you're at about 9 million for total flood impacts from a 100-year storm coming in on top of sea level rise in 2035. And again, these are order of magnitude to get us in the ballpark with geographically what's impacted and financially what does that mean to the community. And we then carry that out through each of these years. The sea level rise flooding has now made its way to Child Street in a no action scenario. Market Street is very much flooded every day. And the storm event goes a little further and impacts more properties as it moves its way to the south for those scenarios. Now, these are cumulative numbers. So this is an additional 75 properties flooded. It doesn't concern what we did in 2035. It's an additional sort of concentric circle. And what you've got here is another 75 properties that are flooded, another 65 buildings that are impacted, 121 housing units, since this is deeper into the residential zone, 182 residents displaced, and the same lost tax revenue, 300,000, and the building loss cost, because we have many more buildings impacted, some of which, this is, by the way, lot by lot specific, some of which are much more higher value properties because some of the commercial buildings are in this mix as well. And obviously, as the sea level rise goes further across the zone, across this phase, there's more impact from that storm event that takes place. I think that's the best way. Yeah, we want to link this to and sort of give you the whole picture. We will be. Yes, but at the end, yes. And Paul will talk about that. Yeah. So 2070 is the sort of similar. You walk right through it. You can see the impacts have spread out. The flooding during a storm event is larger. Another 113 properties flooded, 162 housing units lost, 240 residents displaced, another $400,000. Again, this is not cumulative. This is for this additional area outside of those first two phases that I discussed. So as we, obviously are getting into, deeper flooding that is impacting more properties, that cost rises. And finally, 2100, and Bob always, when Bob and I chat about this project, we always talk about the fact that you want to focus on what people can sort of see in front of them, but we do have to be thinking about the very long term based on the forecasts that are currently in. And this is simply high tide flooding in 2100. And then the storm event obviously comes on top of that and floods a greater extent. And so those costs rise as well. Again, this is if no action is taken. This is if just sort of nature has its way. And this is what runs through those areas based on what your current asset values are. And so the cumulative impact over time, we did want to give a picture of this, that it's a total of 383 properties within the project area, 306 buildings total. That's about 541 housing units that you've got in there. And residents displaced, this is mind you to 2100, but is 812 based on your current built configuration that you've got. So a significant impact over the long term on those areas. And we've graphed that out so we can sort of see over each of the phases what the severity is and how those impacts run through. And then we've done sort of the full calculations across all of the scenarios. And one thing I would urge you to do is to not look at just that last hurdle and say, oh my gosh, we can't do anything about it. We're talking about a very long period of time, 2100. And that really you've got to work phase by phase is what successful communities are doing. Is they're not sort of thinking about, they are thinking about the long-term end goal, but your actions are based by what's in front of you, not sort of thinking about the full, end scenario. So I think those are the sort of key pieces to think about. It's the people metrics, it's the dollar metrics, it's the business metrics to think about. I want to end the no action scenario. There is hope coming, right? There's two really good scenarios I'm going to share with you. But the no action scenario, available funding, what covers that? What happens to you if there's no action taken proactively? So you're going to have, by those who have federal flood insurance, you're going to have claims. And you'll have the federal payment, but there is a property owner share to that insurance as well. And that's a critical thing to bear in mind. So there will be costs locally. Federal disaster assistance after a federally declared event, critical and really welcome. We've seen in recent years, though, with the increasing number of events, the rising number of claims, that Congress's debates about this, about designating this and setting this money aside, has gotten more cantankerous and more cantankerous. And so, will that system remain in place in the future? I can't say. But people who are watching this are sort of saying, will the federal system stay the same? And then below it, will banking and lending and insurance stay the same? Will banks still write mortgages on properties in these zones? Will insurers still cover that for the homeowner's insurance? So those are other things to be thinking about in terms of how this is paid for, how this change, takes place. If you do no action, you're responding to events rather than proactively dealing with things. And then lastly, or one of the last things, environmental impacts. We've seen from other disasters that have come through that if people start walking away from properties, there's an environmental issue there with asbestos, lead paint, tanks in the buildings. You've got to deal with J. Mills Park and the landfill that's there. And those DEM registered sites, will those get proactively cleaned up, or will they be, those underground tanks be flooded, and will there be a pollution issue from those? And stormwater quality is still a huge issue if you're not mitigating stormwater. The long-term quality of those bodies of water is a key issue that goes on as well. And roadways, we've done a significant amount of work, which you can see on our website, but basically, we've seen from the maps that 100-year storm events are going to cut off places and flood the roadways, but regular everyday flooding in this zone that Bob showed you by 2035 will become something if nothing has changed. Child Street will have the same issue by 2050. And the bridge that carries 136 over Belcher Cove is going to hit that flooding by 2050 as well. And those roadway impacts are, rerouting of traffic on a regular basis. We all see that with Swansea, right down by the Old Providence Road, and the desalination plant that they close at spring tides, and your evacuation routes are hit as well. And accelerated roadway deterioration and your increased repair costs, whether that's Rhode Island DOT or the town for the town roads. Precedents for no action we've seen them. It's Superstorm Sandy and Staten Island. It's Hurricane Katrina, and not just New Orleans itself, but those lower, Louisiana bayou communities that I think of as being a little more like Warren, which are right, built up against those marshlands and becoming inaccessible, and now accessible only by boat. So that is the downer part of my presentation, but you've got to have that reality, because that is a path you can choose, but it is not the only path, that you can choose. So we've looked at best practices for communities that are doing what we call phased relocation and restoration. Basically, our mapping that we're sort of sharing with you here is that you follow these 4 phases, but in a way that you're adapting over time, not just the increased impact over time, but you're adapting. So there's the potential for buyouts of properties that are in the most danger of repetitive flooding and storm damage during those phases. You don't do it across everything, but you focus on those things that are most in danger immediately. There's removal of local streets. There's removal of utilities, and restoration of wetlands, which can be a powerful tool for protective buffering, cutting down on wave action, flood storage. So it's not that you've got your streets and your built environment immediately next to it, but you've got buffering between you and those impacts. So phase 1, we did some mapping, and we sort of looked at, okay, if you're going to deal with first things first, and you realize you can't fund all this at one time, you can't take all this action at one time, what's phase 1 look like? So phase 1 is outlined in red here, and you can obviously see it sort of hugs the shoreline of Belcher Cove. It takes into the property on Belcher, the front Belcher Cove on that west side. Half of J Mills Park is within it, and it does take into account that sort of sluiceway culvert system that goes really from the section where the garages are, the head of Redmond Street is, out across Market Street. And it also takes into account the lower end of Metacom Avenue, where it's immediately surrounded by marsh as well. And so what does that mean? So again, we're going to keep the number of properties the same as we did for the first analysis. There's an acquisition cost, and this is based on current value as assessed, there's a cost to remove those buildings. There's a utility removal cost, and there's a form of site clearing and restoration cost. This is for that sort of whole phase to do that. So this is something that you carry out between now and 2035, when those impacts are going to be, fully hitting those properties. You want to be ahead of it and proactively going at that. The one thing I want to note is, while that is a $15 million number, as I want to say again, we've taken sort of the most conservative route of saying, here's the worst. Here's what we find for precedents as for being the most expensive things. The other key here is that there are a lot of federal funding programs that are proactively funding this kind of removal right now at a 75-25% ratio. So the feds come in for 75%. Programs differ, but it's less for the local community on a predictable basis than disaster response can be sometimes. So that's a key piece. We also have to keep in here your lost annual tax revenue. Those properties, no longer contributing to your tax base. They become something that's a buffer against that edge. But it gets people out of harm's way. It gets buildings out of harm's way. It gets environmental impacts out of harm's way. And it potentially makes your roadways more resilient. So we combined with this removal roadway adaptation costs. And in this scenario, what we call for is 350 feet of Market Street, the lowest lying part, to essentially get a temporary upgrade and be raised so that it can continue functioning while you plan for the rest of your road network. What happens to Child Street? What happens to 136? But you can't just sort of stop access to these properties as they adapt. So there's some minor adaptation built in for the Market Street area. By the way, these ranges come from a national survey we did of projects that are currently ongoing, have been in construction, or have been out to bid. So we know those numbers per foot on a sort of order of magnitude basis. So again, we continue down through the phases. Phase 2 follows where sea level rise is predicted, more of J Mills Park and in the lower Wood Street area. Across Market, the lower lying areas are Mason and Asselin Streets, and then Redmond Street again. And some properties that front on now the east side of Metacom Avenue. We also include the Metacom, the Route 136 bridge, where it crosses as well. Sorry, Marcus. And so number of properties in that, it's same as we showed before in phase 2. There's a property acquisition cost, there's a demo cost, there's a utility removal cost, and there's site clearing and restoration. And again, we're running these at the most pessimistic numbers, but that's sort of what that next phase costs to get out of harm's way. And so roadway much more sophisticated, and when we get to phase 2 between 2035 and 2050, and basically 136 has to be adapted as it goes through its approach road on Kikamuit. The bridge itself needs to be adapted, and Market Street has some adaptation within it as well. That's an option as to whether you want to keep Market operational or whether you sort of switch your east-west to maybe a more resilient Child Street, and Market Street at some point gets abandoned. Because that is a very expensive project that is not going to have a very long life. Those are decisions for the community to talk about. And Child Street, and then there's the bridge. So a lot of roadway infrastructure in that second phase. Phase 3, obviously you saw with the expansion of flooding, there's a lot more impact to properties, to residential properties here. And now if we do nothing, we've sort of crossed Child Street, and several of those very significant commercial properties on the south side of Child are impacted in this. And so what happens to those? Is there a hardening of the defenses here? Is it a buyout? We've run the scenario as a buyout, but some communities have sort of decided to have a line in the sand, if you will, and harden your infrastructure, protect certain areas that are upland, sort of up in the watershed, further back. So these numbers are quite high because of those commercial properties and because of the numbers of properties impacted. And then there is some road adaptation cost as well that takes place within this. You've got a longer length of this portion of Route 136 and a longer length of Child as well that's impacted by this. And finally, phase 4, which you saw as the sort of, I think someone in the audience said swimming pool. There's even more here. You're talking about, sort of all the areas that are over here, back with Cutler Mill Complex, and the areas on the front of Child Street and the old rail line where it goes around. So a lot of very expensive property here, and much more residential property over by Everett in that area as well. So those costs are significant as well as we head over to that area. For, again, property acquisition, demolition, utility removal, site clearing, and environmental cleanup. So one of the things I do want to raise here as I hit the last roadway one is that the statewide planning did a great assessment of roadways that are in danger. I don't know of studies that are currently going on from DOT about adaptation. So we've sort of taken the liberty of saying, if you adapt it as some other states and communities have done, here are what we see for some of those costs, and applied them to that. But to be honest, when you begin to get into this, you want to dig into your detailed engineering and, how does property access work if you elevate a roadway? What's mitigation on that site where that building is and that driveway works? So that's as you get into this, we've sort of wanted to give you the order of magnitude costs, but we're hoping that this project serves as a springboard for sort of doing your next phase of planning and design to figure out exactly how this works. But we have to begin somewhere. So there's sort of a total for the whole area between now and 2100, and the cost that exists for that. But that's over a very long period of time. So you've got, you've got sort of 80 years to be digging into this and moving with this. So again, for the presentation, for those of you looking on the website, we sort of costed that out so folks can see over time what that is, that it's sort of in the first 2 phases, fairly reasonable given what other communities have done and dealt with, motivating between now and 2050, and the costs that are there, and then planning there. One thing I do want to note, I had a good conversation with our climate resiliency officer, and one of the things that you always have to keep in mind is this is a shifting topic. If our rate of burning greenhouse gases changes, do the models change? Is there a change in sea level rise? We don't know. That's going to be something that communities are going to continue to evolve with as they move forward, building it into the science as it's currently going. So one of the things that this scenario allows you to do is to create natural wetland buffers with this area that you've retreated from, you've relocated from, and that can improve stormwater quality. It can wave events or can mitigate wave events. And part of this is also dealing with existing environmental pollution and getting that out of the way of those 30 fuel and chemical tanks that you've currently got in the project area, and those domestic heating oil tanks that are in probably a lot of those properties. The great news is you are not the first community to wrestle with this issue. Lots of other communities have been dealing with this for the past 3 decades. So I want to give some examples to hopefully give a little bit of hope. Gloucester County, Virginia, very similar in topography to you all, with marshland abutting some low-lying residential zones and farm zones. They had 100 acres of low-lying land that was repeatedly flooded. They removed 59 buildings. They made a decision to harden some of that, and they've elevated 57 of those buildings to give them a longer life. Total cost was $11 million for that project. The buildings are a little smaller scale. Cost of construction is a little cheaper, and it was probably about 10 years ago. So their cost for building was about $100,000. More parallel to you all, although a later period of construction, is Onion Creek in Austin, Texas. This neighborhood was basically built in a zone it never should have been built in. And 290 acres was repeatedly flooded in events. And this is before Harvey, and those events we think of for Texas flooding. And they basically removed 850 buildings. FEMA paid 75%, different federal agencies paid 75% of that cost. And they removed 850 buildings and converted it to parkland and recreation zone, which also serves as flood storage for the community. So this is taking place across the United States. There's some great best practices. Some buildings are relocated out of those zones if the owner can find a new place to land it. Some communities are helping find those places to land those buildings on upland to go. Some local examples you might know of, Warwick and Cranston have both been engaging in this for the past really 20 years. Pecasset River area in Warwick, Perkins Ave in Cranston. This is an article from EcoRI News. And there was just a recent discussion at a conference session. Those communities still have more applicants than funding. People are still looking to get rid of those houses in those repeatedly flooded areas. And sort of I'm sick of pumping my basement, and I'm sick of having my first floor every 20 years get flooded. So they're actively pursuing that restoration of flood zone and removal of buildings. And you have a fantastic opportunity to improve your coastal shorelines as well as part of this, which is something that's happening all across Narragansett Bay, and restoration of marshes as well, which act as great natural living buffer systems in your area. So there are several sources of funding, and I think we're going to see more with this current administration. And certainly Congress is paying attention to some of the flooding. So EPA has pre-disaster mitigation grants. FEMA has what's called the BRIC program. Army Corps of Engineers has funding pools. U.S. Department of Agriculture has funding pools. And Rhode Island is hopefully gearing up. The Infrastructure Bank has some limited funding, but there was a recent Senate bill that passed for a funding mechanism for climate adaptation in the last session. So you've got some, I think, really strong ability to implement, and certainly from that federal funding standpoint. And one thing that the town has been exploring, and Bobby may need to come over here to talk about it, but is tax incremental financing by linking this with redevelopment of Metacom Avenue. I don't know if you want to talk about that now or after we show the Metacom scenario. Okay. Yep. We're there. So with that, I'm gonna. So Bob's gonna do TIF. I get the bad news.
How can we be creative? We knew we had a situation with sea level rise, but then we also, from an economic development standpoint, and a planning standpoint, Metacom is vastly underutilized. A lot of people heard it make sense.
They can't hear you, Bob, so I think you're gonna have to come. And you know what? I'm gonna give you my spot.
Apologies. So as I was saying, I mean, Arnold and I, when we first talked about going after this grant, it was, how can we, how could we create something that would both address sea level rise and coastal resiliency, but then also be a tool for revitalization of the Metacom corridor. I say it all the time, Metacom represents the very best of 1950s, 1960s planning. It's one-story buildings with acres of parking in front. So as we got into this, I mean, and we really didn't know how this was going to be received, because this is way outside of the roadway that SNAP typically operates in. Economic development is not something that they do. But they jumped at it. I mean, their reviewers thought that this was a model that could be replicated, not just in Rhode Island, but throughout the country. So we were energized by that. And again, so, there are the issues that Arnold has highlighted in the Market Street area, but there's also opportunities in the Metacom area. So the state has struggled with, how do we address affordable housing? How do we address transportation? How do we address economic development? All of those opportunities exist right now on Metacom because our current zoning limits what can be done there. But so last February, pre-COVID, the council indulged me and we talked about what we could do in terms of zoning changes, what we could do in terms of transportation enhancement, what we could do for stormwater improvement. And so although we've gone through what we've gone through for the last 16 months, we've been constantly working on this. So we are working on changes to zoning to allow more density. This gentleman is interested in what's happening at Ocean State Job Lot. There's 8 acres of parking there. That's not serving anybody. But you'll see in a few minutes what the development potential is there, not just for businesses, but for residential, people that might be displaced because of sea level rise, people that might want to relocate to this community because there's proximity to mass transit from Fall River to Boston, or just we're seeing that people just like the community because of all the things that are happening. And there's opportunities for small businesses to expand, not displacement of the existing businesses, but a better location for those businesses. And also create a neighborhood or village center that serves those residential communities on either side of Metacom that people are dependent on their cars to go to now. So, I mean, it was a holistic approach to, you know, where do we have development opportunities in Warren? Certainly in our historic downtown, we don't. In the eastern part of town, in Twislet, we don't because we lack public water, we lack public sewer. In the eastern part of town, we have the same challenges. So Metacom Avenue, that corridor really represented the only opportunity for us to say we could do some additional development. So we talk about things like form-based code, which is a predictable approval process, expedited approval process. We're in the process of discussing that with the community now. But how do we pay for all this? So we're talking about tax increment finance. And very simplistically, tax increment financing is a mechanism, it's a financing mechanism that municipalities can use, where you say, okay, if we are creating more density here, and presently, just use Job Lot Plaza as an example, that we are collecting just over $100,000 a year in property taxes now. If we just took the hypothetical scenario that we've used for development there, that number would increase to about 1.3 million in annual property taxes. So there is $1.1 million available on an annual basis that the town would have to reinvest in either property buyouts, stormwater improvements, sanitary sewer improvements. That doesn't affect the tax rate of other residents within town. How were we able to do that? Because we made zoning changes. We created more density and we utilized something that didn't cost us money to do it. But as I like to refer to it, it's the but-for test. If you didn't do it, you wouldn't have it. So without getting overly complicated in that, I'm going to kick this over to Paul to talk about some of the scenarios we came up with. And I'll probably jump in unnecessarily.
Thanks, Bob. I'm Paul Atman with Union Studio, and Erica Thornton is participating as well. And I'll make the transition between what Bob and Arnold is talking about and just go through some of these slides, because I think, Bob, you just covered some of this in a few minutes ago. But what, you know, the form-based code and looking at what sort of other mechanisms we can utilize to make a better place along Metacom Avenue, where we can realize the potential of more density, more residential, more commercial space, and really use the form-based code and other mechanisms and reimagine our zoning ordinance and other mechanisms to create quality spaces that can grow and accommodate us now and grow, help us grow in the future. When we started to look at the Metacom Avenue, we started looking at one area, and this is probably, Arnold, your point of expertise, but to really look at Metacom Avenue, one step is to probably reimagine how traffic flows up and north and south, and to envision a 4-lane highway to more of a 2.5 lane, with one lane going north, one lane going south, with a middle turning radius or turning lane, and then giving a shoulder enough that's safe and wide enough for cyclists and then also pedestrians on the sidewalk. With this could be a safer transportation route with RIPTA, because Bob and the town and main manufacturers and employers along Metacom Ave have been talking to RIPTA about servicing Metacom Avenue more and more, because people do depend on the bus to get to work from Providence and Fall River and other connections.
And I think too that we are looking to create the amount of residential development that we're looking for. Part of that is going to be dependent on there being reliable public transportation. Paul's right, we've got to introduce expanded bus service on the Metacom corridor. There's one bus in the morning and there's one bus at night. It starts at Kennedy Plaza, it ends at Fish Road and Tiverton. I always suggest that that's a drug deal gone bad. That, I mean, who's going there at 6 o'clock in the morning and then who's coming back? But again, I mean, if this is really transit-oriented development that we're looking at, it's going to require that there be reliable and dependable public transportation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So this here is a map of the Metacom corridor study area, and there I'm going to focus first off on the Ocean State Job Lot Plaza, where that was our first sort of foray into this, and we did this back in February and March, and I think people had seen earlier images of it. But it's really to start taking a very conceptual look at where and how there's some development opportunities on some of the larger unutilized lots along Metacom Avenue, and what that what the yield is as we start considering relocating businesses and residents from other vulnerable areas, aka Market Street. So you can see how, if you just blur your eye, how the Metacom Avenue becomes a little bit more focused and defined. There's street edges. There's opportunities to create mixed use buildings that have residential on top, commercial and retail on the ground floor, and also provide parking on the back sides. And then in the areas where there's side streets into residential, there's always an opportunity and sort of a very sensitive approach to create some residential density of townhomes and other multifamilies that are a nice transition from the Metacom corridor site. Yeah.
On the record, so folks can sort of know where this comes from, is that when we look at these sites along Metacom Avenue, we're doing this as concept level only. So one of the jobs with the SNEP grant is to imagine what a different future looks like in Warren and what it feels like. So it's really intended just to show redevelopment and site layout and design potential. This isn't like something ready to go to construction tomorrow. It is even not something where the owner has indicated that they're ready to redevelop at this point. What we wanted to do was to choose some typical sites of size, of depth, of relationship to the street, and show them for illustration only. What could the former KFC Taco Bell, dear as it was to our heart, what could that site look like? And same for Job Lot and same for a series of other ones. So I just want to make sure we get that on the record for folks watching today or watching us as a video. This isn't committing an owner to something or speaking on behalf of an owner, but it's sort of using these sites as examples of what could be on Metacom.
So looking at Ocean State Job Plaza as the first sort of, study site, many people know it very well. Here's Metacom Avenue running north and to south, with Lauren's Restaurant here on the front of the site, close to the street. We have an existing auto body shop right on the corner. And then there's also the Job Lot Plaza building that in this scenario is proposed to be demolished. That's okay. No worries. Still getting some feedback. So with the form-based code and other, without going into, okay, we'll try again. So this here is, again, a very concept study, and we started with Ocean State Job Lot Plaza because it really was the largest site that has the most potential for a large transformation and implementation and re-envisioning of this site for more optimal use for commercial uses, retail uses, residential uses, as well as institutional uses that couldn't even consider a performing arts center in a collaboration with an area university that could then create much more of a village center, as Bob had said, or a center along Metacom Avenue. And without going into the specifics of each of the building types, we have just in general proposing that at Metacom Avenue, there's some larger buildings, 3 to 4 to 5 stories high, and then with perhaps a boulevard that brings you into a center and a connected street network, brings you to some other mixed use and multi-family buildings that create a real space and an outdoor green area that is fronted not only by the commercial and the residential, but also the perhaps a performing arts center or institutional use here in Building A. But then we also started to explore that this is not the only building type, but there's a variety of building types. And then as you come along the north edge along Vernon Street that people know well, there's an access point to the existing job lot right at the very northwest corner that is a quick slide in and up the hill and around the corner around the fitness center, and watch out, you don't know what to expect. But that is sort of a nice transition that you can have a townhouse style, single family, it's attached single family that gives that density and also that scale that transitions to the Vernon Street and the more residential core. So with this this is again one of the larger sites that we looked at, and I think Erica is going to now pass it on to Erica to talk a little bit more about some of the other sites that we looked at that offers similar opportunities. We'll take questions toward the end if that's okay. All right, Ron? Yeah. So Erica, are you here?
Yes, I'm here.
Great, thank you.
Great, thanks, Paul. So here we're going to move on to working down the block, sort of down Metacom in a southern direction. And so you can see Block D now is that job lot site, now in the context of the Metacom conceptual plan that we're showing here. You could see that the land use is mapped out now. And so as we move to Block C, we have 4 property owners in this area, which we've shown as the red dashed line. So for this scenario in this block, we've looked at that to see what would happen if these 4 owners redeveloped, but in a very more cohesive way. So you can see that the parking's in the back, but we've got shared access across those parking lots, even shared access into the job lot site, really helping to reduce parking demands between the businesses, and also reducing curb cuts and making it a little bit more safer for pedestrians along Metacom Avenue. So along Metacom, you can see with the orange and the yellow buildings, we're continuing that pattern, just like we did with Ocean State Job Lot, where we've got mixed 3-story mixed use buildings and a multifamily building. And as you come along Seymour Avenue and in the back lot where the self-storage is, we've shown a sort of townhouse, attached townhouses, single family community centered around a little community common green. And this really helps to, just like the townhouses on the job lot site, transition to those single family neighborhoods down on Seymour Street. And so you can start to see this street edge develop on Metacom that's really just creating a much more pedestrian friendly environment. You can imagine someone living in one of the apartment buildings being able to walk much more safely and comfortably now to those uses onto the job lot site, looking at the common green, or maybe even that linear park on Vernon. Next slide.
You can also talk a little bit about some of the yield of numbers of units and square footages that you can see here between Block C and D. As we start thinking about Market Street, people coming or businesses coming up, and the infrastructure now is in place and the mechanisms are in place, in 20, 30 years, these are the sort of the yields that we're looking at in terms of residential units, what the parking needs are for the residential and commercial. And it's a real fine balance of finding what is the optimum scenario for parking, residential, to serve the parking, the residential and the commercial and retail. Thanks, Erica. Next.
So next we've got across the street from the job lot site and what we're calling the CVS site, block C, we've got Block E and Block F. So Block E, both of these blocks we looked at them as in maybe perhaps they were combined into one property. Maybe a property owner came and purchased multiple sites and developed them as one. So for Block E, we have the Patterson Homestead block. This is much smaller in scale than the lots we've shown so far. So you're talking mostly 2 to 3 story buildings. We've got mixed use again on Metacom with a smaller scale multifamily, more like your walk-up type apartment that's able to transition to those residences behind on Patterson and Homestead, and also a row of townhomes again on Homestead that also again transitions to those single family neighborhoods. And then on Block F, we've got 3 to 5 story mixed use buildings along Metacom with all the parking in the back, really reducing those curb cuts again, and a smaller multifamily building along Laurel Ave. And with looking at both of these lots, just like in Block C, we've really shown the intent of what the form-based code will be in the future, putting the parking in the rear, creating pedestrian passages that make it easier for people to walk around, creating little plazas and park spaces between the buildings, and really optimizing public space where possible. And so again, like Paul said, this is really conceptual, but we've sort of done some estimates of what the commercial and residential yields would be. So you're looking at a total of about 130 units between these two sites. Next slide. And now as we move to the southernmost blocks in the project area, we've got Block A and Block B. Block B, the Ridgeway and Canario block, is the smallest block that we've got. And so we really just maximize the frontage along Metacom Avenue with a mixed use building with the parking behind. And the advantage to having this small block size is nice because now you have only side access parking. So there's really no curb cuts along Metacom Avenue. It's really making a nice user-friendly, pedestrian-friendly environment there. And then on Block E, the greenhouse site, we've got this really deep site, so we can sort of transition the uses and step down in scale as we move back through the site. So being a friendly neighbor to those single family residences behind. So we've got a mixed use building, again, on Metacom Avenue. We've got the 3 to 4 story multifamily buildings behind, and townhouses in the rear. And so, and also another thing I want to point out too is with all of the sites, and I think you can see it pretty clearly here, is we've tried to really take stormwater management into account, thinking about, sea level rise and stormwater runoff. We've got making these parking lots not just seas of asphalt. So we got wider medians where you can have spaces for landscaped areas and trees, creating a much more comfortable environment and shade, and lots of shade. So on this block, we are looking at about a total of 124 units. That's also including the 18 units that have already been permitted to develop just south of that Block A. Next slide. And so we wanted to talk about a little bit about some precedents and examples of development, redevelopment. We know that this is not new, redevelopment along commercial corridors. It's definitely becoming more popular as well. So this is an image of South County Commons, which I'm sure many people are familiar with, down in Wakefield. You can see there's retail on the first floor with offices and businesses above, and really creating a great public space, lots of landscaping, and this, popular common area at the end of the main street there that can host a lot of different events. And this is something that you can see that Metacom could become this type of development. And more examples here of sort of the streetscape and public space that you could see of different scales and types. So we've got things that vary from hardscape plazas to softscape plazas, like you see down with the South County Commons, or something more in between. We Trolley Square on the bottom left-hand side that shows, also a great example of a mixed small scale multifamily building in the background something that you could see on Metacom. And in the top, okay, that's good. I was just going to mention the top right is showing some of the transit, how to manage, what can you do to manage all the transit on Metacom Avenue with managing bikes and bringing in bus lanes and things like that. And so this slide is mostly focused on the residential types that you might see along Metacom. So you have a variety of housing types, from smaller scale townhomes to small to medium scale multifamily buildings. And you can see how these buildings can have articulation, they can add character to the area. And these are things that can be embedded in the form-based code to really make sure that you get the types of buildings that you want to see here in your community. And lastly, we've got two sort of examples of some great public spaces. We've got Columbia Heights Plaza in DC, which is along a redeveloped corridor in DC. It's really a great example of, investing in the public space. It's become a focal point for the neighborhood. There's farmers markets, performances, outdoor theaters that happen all year round. So it's great public amenity. And on the right-hand side is Glenwood Park in Atlanta. It's actually redeveloped over a recycling center. It's a mixed use neighborhood development. So this is Brassfield Square, and you're looking over from a townhouse down into that really wonderful plaza with the mixed use building behind, really showing like the scale that you might see along Metacom. And now I will pass it to Arnold to talk about the tax income to the town.
And, we went really conservative on our, sort of calculations of future value. But part of this project is to say, okay, if you take those physical visions that, Union Studios has so beautifully created, and now let's ripple that through the financial system. What does that look like for the town? So these are the actual numbers, actual units, unit counts, commercial square footages. We took a existing value that is based on what you currently have for multi-unit apartment buildings and some mixed-use commercial/residential buildings. And we rippled that through the new square footages of those buildings. I think that, we've seen in redevelopment projects, typically that value can be higher, but we wanted to show it for conservative. So if you look at those last three columns on the right-hand side, you'll see existing property tax payment. What do each of those sites, those parcels, yield currently? And it's a total of $382,000 coming into the town. And as Bob said, the Job Lot Plaza is currently 130 with all of its attached parcels. And then what the future tax payments are on a really conservative basis. And the yellow column is the increase in income to the town. We're going to be doing the next level of detail when we get into this, working with a real estate expert and doing some more of these calculations of value to sort of look at recent construction projects. But this is sort of rippling it through based on your current precedents within your tax system. So that, as Bob said, that's money you can use every year to do adaptation. Every year you can do improvements with to move things forward. So with that, I think we wanted to, we have a huge amount of information to download. I'm not going to apologize for downloading the information. I do want to note again for the record, for folks watching this or at home, that this presentation is on the project website. You can go through at your own leisure, look at all these numbers, you can print it out, and then we'll also upload this presentation. So we want to get to the facilitated discussion. And I just want to throw out there sort of 6 prompts, and I'll pull up the chat window as well so folks can begin to ask questions there. But we wanted to get, first off, your reactions to those different possible scenarios, and the no action scenario, the phased relocation restoration, and then Metacom Avenue. Really want to hear, because they're interlocking. Were you aware of the actions that the town can take to address climate change? Other actions we haven't talked about, we haven't thought of, that Warren might consider. And then really, how should the town work with property owners, residents, and business owners in both Market Street and Metacom? What can we be doing to involve more people, to sort of involve them in the process? And then your thoughts about transportation routes, what you think should happen to those transportation routes. I know we'll have a lot of discussion, so I want to go to the final one for folks who might step off early. It's sort of what you can do next. I just want to put one thing on your calendar. You can always offer us comments through the project website. You can see the things we've done on prior, but on September 8th, we will be coming back and we will be presenting sort of the final scenario based on what we hear tonight and the work that we've done to date. And the final report is tied to December, to a December delivery date for the town. So with that, Bob, I'm going to let you sort of facilitate as the official town person. Yeah, chats. Yeah.
Questions or comments from anybody here? Joe, I know you want to know the question.
Yeah, I have a couple. My first question is dealing with the areas on that you were discussing. Those are all impacted heavily by stormwater runoff, freshwater. So you were bringing the focus on the seawater coming in. But when you look at the areas you're talking about, it starts actually all the way up that behind Kentucky Fried Chicken that you mentioned. So we have all of that I think if you're going to be looking, I mean, this is a massive problem. And I think that this level of optimism is great. But the psychological impact of the planning, when this is all, when what you're talking about starts kicking in, and you're dealing with fresh water coming down, and you're dealing with potentially the American tourist, and uninhabitable. I think the finances that you're talking about aren't realistic. How do those kind of things come into play? This was a great proposal if we weren't talking about it with Mother Nature involved.
So I think, a couple things. The sea level rise issue is real.
That's what I'm saying.
The stormwater issue we can address. So any new development is going to have advanced EMPs. It's going to have much better stormwater control than we have now, both to control flow and also to control the amount of pollutants that go into the river. How do we pay for it? That's why we talk about tax increment financing. That's why we talk about, how can we finance this, supplement whatever the federal government or the Army Corps has, but how can we proactively finance this? The only leverage that we have is that we create value by creating density, by creating more, amending the zoning to allow for more density, which in turn creates more property tax. And that, you earn interest on that. Is it going to solve the problem entirely? No, it's not. But we can be much more proactive ahead of this, knowing that this is 2035 is 14 years from now. And so, I'm hopeful that I'm here 14 years from now. Hopefully I'm here 14 minutes from now, but that's the way this is going. But I think we need to be proactive instead of reactive. And, this is not 100% solution. But I think we're way ahead of the game in comparison to other communities, not just in Rhode Island, but in the region, for taking the approach that we're taking. I say it all the time, when there's a hurricane, a building collapses, people instantaneously react and they can comprehend the significance of that. When we talk about 6 inches of sea level rise, it's like watching a pot boil, and people don't get it until it happens. So, we needed to start with, this is as bad as it can get, but this is not 100 years from now. This is 14 years from now.
But what I'm afraid of is connecting the dots of the scenario and the world we live in, United States, Rhode Island. Life isn't going to be the same. So like in 14 years, when Belcher's Cove is uninhabitable, there's been a lot of habit all over the place as well. And what I'm concerned about is the scenario plays out on values that we hold currently. Like when you look at the properties of $236,000, you said some properties over there, they're worthless.
And that's part of, I think, a large, and Arnold and I talk about this often, this is an education exercise. It's an economic development exercise, it's a resilience exercise, but it's educating people to, these are what the impacts of these things are going to be. And one of the things that really frustrates me, and I've had this conversation with Roberta, is that from statewide planning is, where are the lenders, the insurers? They're not at the table yet on these things. So suddenly they're going to say, we're not going to insure your property anymore. We're not going to lend money on your property anymore. And that's significant. So, but the fact that even, that the state is not like taking this holistic approach is, we know we have a problem here, we think we can solve it here, but in between we have some of the issues that you've raised. I don't have an easy answer, but the fact that we're having a conversation about it, I think, distinguishes us from many others.
The thing I think successful communities are doing that are addressing this issue is they're adopting an overarching vision. This might be get people out on properties out of harm's way, strengthen your assets that need to remain over time, and redevelop those areas that you can redevelop. Then you become opportunistic with all of the different funding sources and resources that you can find to address each individual piece. There's not one pot of money that's going to address everything. But to your point on stormwater, there is a fair amount of funding to go out there and to improve your municipal stormwater systems to handle the increased precipitation events, to deal with that fresh water that's coming down and impacting. But at the same time, different source of income. When sites get redeveloped on Metacom, they're going to have to comply to great stormwater standards now. So put in place the overall vision first, and then the lines are going to fill in underneath it for the steps that are very individualistic to take. That'd be my approach. Paul made a good point that this gentleman here was the first person to ask.
Well, my original question was, I see on one of the times the job line, I think we've been sponsored residential. And I thought, you're mixing it out with the business, you know, I would have understood mixed use, but I couldn't figure out why in the middle. I thought residential would be more peripheral, you know, kind of say.
So the idea was to create what we refer to as a village center or a town center, to create a downtown where there's not a downtown. So on the Metacom facing, you would have mixed use, you have a commercial or professional use on the ground floor, you might have residential above it, and then embedded in the site is more of a traditional residential use that could either be rental or ownership. We included, as Paul had alluded, performing arts space, because we think performing arts space because we think there's a local university that has a need for this. And then, you know, the idea is in the rear of it, you could have more mixed use. So you'd have more residential on the top and then commercial uses on the bottom. Because I mean, the idea is to create a neighborhood there. I mean, exactly.
The other question I have to show you, since it really encompasses the area I'm going to talking about, is whether we're going to put that bike path behind Libby Lane, run it down to downtown across the river.
Well, they're going to bring it to Libby Lane, but they're not going to run it straight down to behind Cutler. I mean, and that's one of the things we're looking at. Right, and then initially they had looked at bringing it along that former abandoned railway line, which had gone behind Cutler. There's wetlands in there. So, I mean, so one of the things we've shown here is creating a dedicated bike lane. So then maybe the connection is at Seymour or Vernon to get across to the bike path. That's out to bid right now. That will happen. Construction on that bridge will start this fall. Yep. Going out to Twisted. Yeah. So the plan right now is construction would start on that in the fall. They'll stop during the winter and it'll be finished in the spring. Good for you. Phase one, like the first area, the one belt, Mexico, and community impact.
I have a question. I was looking at that. Connects to that as far as like how do you reach out to professional space and what kind of disclosures are we obligated to give current homeowners, future homeowners on buy-in, because you know if you're boom going on as it is right now. You know, there's a great deal on a home that's in that phase one or phase two area. What are we telling people?
Yeah, well, I mean, and again, I mean, Senator Felag left, but I mean, again, I think, you know, that is, you know, have to be careful. No, I mean, in terms of Market Street, in terms of disclosure, I mean, you know, it's buyer beware. I mean, you know, I think we get out as much information as we can. I think that Arnold did a good job of quantifying that, you know, these aren't assumptions that we just came up with. These are assumptions that are based on the most current science that's available. People can make their own determination whether or not they want to believe that science or not, or how accurate that science is. But I mean, certainly, you know, if somebody is looking at what the cost of private flood insurance is, whether they can get flood insurance, what homeowners insurance is going to cost, that should enlighten them as terms of what the risk that potentially they're going to be facing. And again, I mean, it's been a frustration of mine throughout this process is that lenders and insurers are not at the table having this conversation with us. The largest reinsurer for flood insurance in the world is domiciled in Rhode Island, FM Global. And I don't know how many meetings I go to. I mentioned FM Global and check my email every day, and nobody from FM Global is reaching out to me for a job or anything else. So I mean, you know, I'm going to say it again. I mean, there's somebody that should be at the table on this conversation.
One thing I would say for homeowners and for anybody advising people about this is, if you haven't been there, floodfactor.com. It's kind of order. I think that flood factor. If you Google it, it'll be the first thing that shows up. It is a data scientist who is a flooding geek, and in a good way. I mean that affectionately. Who basically has made the federal data and all of the storm event data essentially transparent. So you can put in any address in the United States, and it will show you flood risk for that property. And it's a really great tool to understand personal risk rather than trying to look at a map and figure out where your house is. So Flood Factor is the company.
And Bob, I think Brett had a.
Yeah, hi. What's been the experience of those communities that you highlighted, Virginia and Texas, where they had to do these buyouts? And as Kelly was saying, you know, it's a challenge to actually get people to buy in or sell. I just wondered if you had knowledge of their experiences in those communities. And as a follow-up, when you posted all your numbers, there was the federal portion, which is 75%, and the private, which is 25%. Those are some pretty significant numbers. And I just wondered if it's a chicken and egg thing with this TIF funding. It's like, is that private funding coming? Where's that private funding coming from?
So
They're big numbers.
before Arnold speaks to what happened outside of the state, we can talk about what happened in Warren and Cranston, where, you know, coming up with a strategy for home buyouts is critical, because what typically happens is that there's always going to be one holdout that thinks they're going to be the last one and they're going to get more money. That's something that we have not finalized yet. I mean, because of Warren raising this issue with when we were doing a project with Barrington, the University of Pennsylvania, there has been at least 3 or 4 meetings with Relocation and Institute and other stakeholders around the state to talk about buyouts. But I don't think anybody's talking about it as much as we are. But so one of the mechanisms that we're talking about is when we use tax increment financing as an example for partial funds. There are funding programs through the Army Corps of Engineers. There's funding through FEMA. So what we're looking at is, can we bundle all those together and come up with a formula that this is what you're going to get based on value. It's not precise, we haven't gotten there yet, but I don't think that, I can't speak to what the experience was in Virginia or in Texas, but one of the meetings that we have with Raymond, we had folks up from the Charlotte area. I mean, there are areas of the country that have successfully put into place property buyouts. Areas in the upper Mississippi River area in Iowa have dealt with this. Some of it might just be that the community makes the decision that they're going to take these properties by eminent domain, condemnation, and you're going to set a value that you hope is fair and that can stand at the legal challenge. You try to avoid it, but that is the ultimate tool that a municipality has.
So there's a lot of literature folks can read and best practices study, especially that FEMA has been doing as they've been switching from the response to emergency and disaster cleanup, sort of model to the trying to get out ahead and prevent loss of life, loss of property model. And so there's some terrific studies, and I'll post those on the website so folks can look them up. But what I'm seeing in the reading and then in the conferences I'm going to where folks are discussing this is that people are more attuned to this issue than ever before. They are especially attuned in areas where more frequent flooding and storm inundation is taking place, and they are more willing to consider selling before their properties diminish in value. further because of those frequent events. It is rippling through the real estate market. You know, that there is a disclosure, you know, form that you have for your most frequent flooding that is on that multiple listing form. So I think what we're seeing is that communities are viewing it as, we're offering you the option to buy out. We're not forcing you to buy out. And you can take that option if you perceive that it is going to be a safer or more financially prudent for you to leave at this moment in time, in concert with a larger buyout program like Onion Creek in Austin is a great example of that. But they did theirs in 3 distinct phases. And they said to people, we would love to buy you out all at once. We can't. So the people who are most in danger, but where the creek sort of necked out, that was the first zone. As that went successfully, more people joined for phase 2. And as they secured funding, they sort of rolled through it. Were there still holdouts? Yes, there were people who kept their house in that zone. They either elevated or they pay really high flood insurance to stay in that community. But they didn't do eminent domain. Not that I'm aware of that. So, yeah. So in terms, to your question, Brand, I think that there's a change in how communities are approaching it, but I also think there's a change in how property owners who perceive a danger, whether that's fiscal or physical. Right. And nothing does it like a Hurricane Sandy, right? That if that happens, that changes behavior. I just want to read a quote from Teresa, because Teresa Crean is with URI, and a lot of the work is built on the work she does. So shout out to her. But one of the notes she has about this is, best available science will continue to be available for informed decision making. There is uncertainty with these scenarios, but currently projections are tracking closely with what we're seeing on the ground, and that's in terms of sea level rise from sort of severity. One way to consider how to move forward is a no regrets approach. So regardless of what presents itself in the future, Warren will have spent public dollars in a way that makes sense for public infrastructure and tax base to the town. So that is something that most towns are sort of taking a conservative approach. If you think something's in that danger zone, start planning now for adaptation. And I know there was I do want to get, and Bob, it's up to you, but I want to get other people a first chance before we come around a second time, if that's okay.
Well, again, I basically, right, I mean, but the FEMA requirements are that you gotta elevate the property on. You know, this is especially non-mechanical. And it's gonna become more and more difficult. I mean, those are in place right now. But if somebody still wants to take that leap of faith, and, you know, once it starts to flood, once it starts to happen, right now, until Noah comes, they're sailing by. No, and I agree with you. I said that earlier. You know, unfortunately, there are all kinds of conspiracies. But you know, it doesn't have the dramatic 2 or 3 day impact of a hurricane or tornado or a wildfire has. But this has a much more long-lasting impact than those two. And those will end and maybe to normal. There's no receding from this. I lived on and I saw that area, how it's going to be, with the scenario that's going to play out. I mean, the water went all the way up Benefit Street to all the way back to the street.
and Market Street. And this is what we're talking about, what's going to happen, like, I guess, by the 20th century, that's what that's going to be.
Some of that could be 14 years.
Yeah.
You know, and it's like the newspaper, I mean, it's a reality.
But people really don't realize it's happening. And Florida's got a piece I don't know about Palmer River. Yeah, well, now it was about the Palmer River, but I put it up on Facebook and they were coming. I started telling people, they were talking about global warming. I said, ever drive by Market Street and it's flooded and it hasn't rained? You know, there was some people said yes, and I said, that's salt water. It's not freshwater water. So that's high. People didn't even realize it. You know, so people, they don't know this is happening. Like I said, until it actually happens, then it's done. It's almost too late.
Jesse?
Yeah, I don't want to get caught up in the minutia of the details to progress, but back to the funding. Like some of my problems are is that I saw the development of the roads. I know, for example, Child Street State Road, but does the state pick up any of that tab? Is that completely our responsibility? Where are they on this? Are they aware of this? Are they helping or hindering? And where are they?
Bob's going to throw it to me so he doesn't get in trouble.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
No, it's a great. So I'm as one of the paid consultants, I should say this and say Bob. So the great thing is the state has really studied the future impacts. If you go to the statewide planning department site, and I think we have the link on our website, there's a great study that shows which roads are going to be impacted in what way by what year. I have not found to date a RIDOT document or initiative that is addressing adaptation for the roadways in the face of that predicted change anywhere in Rhode Island. Now, having said that, Massachusetts is a little bit ahead, maybe 2 years ahead, and Connecticut is behind. Well, Connecticut's just starting their process. So nobody is that I've run into yet is really planning for proactive adaptation to these events. The answer is no.
Market Street, Metacom, and then Market Street out to the map line are part of one ticket funding traffic improvement program from the state. The manager and myself had a conversation with DOT 6 months ago. Can you tell us what the elements of the tip are? They didn't know immediately. They came back and said, we're going to repave Market Street from Main Street to the bridge at over Belcher's Park. When are you going to do that? They were supposed to do that in 2 years. Like, are you doing any kind of stormwater improvements, any drainage improvements? Just going to pay it. I mean, and that's kind of what we're trying to say. That is not really good utilization of resources because that road's going to be underwater. You're not going to deal with drainage. You're not going to deal with stormwater, and you're just going to repave it. I mean, what are you doing? I mean, that's going to be in horrible shape and you know. Because as Butch pointed out, the photo we have in there at the intersection of Redmond and Market right now on a king tide, you have 2 feet of water. Saltwater. I mean, that's not going to stop because you pave your road. It might even get worse. So
The water table over there is saturated as well. That's why Market Street is full of potholes. The infrastructure there is crumbling.
that wetlands goes across South Street, goes almost past Sprinklers.
Oh, I know that, but I mean, like just the road,
Yeah.
people complain about all the
So I
time.
mean, we had, 2 years ago, we had Wood Street collapse because of tidal action underneath the road.
Yeah.
Point of clarification, I think I just missed the point. But, so the first half of the presentation, you're talking about the different scenarios and phases. You have the numbers that we're talking about, the 75-25 split. And then you're talking about development of different parcels, residential, commercial, that sort of thing. Then there's a pivot in the presentation to the Metacom redevelopment. And I guess I missed as I see in phase 1 or whatever, 37 residential.
Yep.
Are those the tie between that to the Metacom redevelopment, are those the numbers that are run through? Because I was left with understanding, okay, I see the $1.2 million of tax increase, but that's ROI on the initial investment of that. So I'm trying to understand that.
So the idea is that, if people are going to be displaced, we don't want them to be displaced from the town. That's one part. And you want to give them an opportunity to continue to live in town. So where would we do that? And where would we create more housing? So Metacom presents that opportunity. But at the same time, if we are going to do that, should we create other opportunities by changing the zoning designations, creating more density, attracting more people to the community potentially, kind of coupling that with what I call transit-oriented development, where there's a reliance more on public transportation. And that increased development funds some of the property buyouts, some of the adaptation measures that have to be taken, some of the environmental cleanup that will happen if people abandon properties. So it was really trying to take a look at how are we going to pay for it. I mean, there were many heads to that dragon in terms of how we could holistically connect what it was we were trying to do. It's a lot. I mean, Arnold and I, how come people don't get this? I mean, we talk about it every day. We get it, but I mean, it's hard for people to. And I try to use the connect the dots. Or I mean, maybe a better analogy is it's a mosaic. So if you're looking at one tile, you see one thing. You pull back and you see a whole different picture. That's what we're trying to do with this.
I totally get it. Would help fund this. I guess what I was trying to understand is, with the development of Metacom, that project development, it would be open up. So that would not be public dollars.
No. So I mean, what you're doing is you're creating. So by allowing developers additional density, that's value. So I mean, the other part of that is extra density. We could say that as part of this extra density, we want a commitment for workforce housing units. I mean, there's many things we can do through zoning.
One thing I just want to add to that point, because I didn't make it on the line clearly, is, one of the things when I think about the good property buyout programs are the person who is deciding to take the offer of the property buyout program is never told where to go, right? They're realizing that the inherent value in that property, they're essentially cashing out, and getting bought out as part of that buyout property, and they're choosing what their living situation is next. Like, we're not looking at a scenario where it's like, hey, we're going to move these 30 people, they're going to definitely move to Metacom Avenue. People have that choice of they're going to stay in Warren, buy another house that's further up on Birchwell Road, or are they going to go downtown, or do they, want to move someplace else, or they might want to go to Metacom Avenue. But that's their choice. Buyout programs are all about that flexibility and choice.
That's a good point. Say, I want to live. Right. I live in Warren, but you have to give me an option.
Right, or I don't want to live in an apartment building on Metacom Avenue. Totally cool. That's where whatever sector wants to buy in that situation.
Does anybody else have any comments or questions?
Yeah, I think this is great because you guys are the first people to talk about this sort of relocation. I personally think you should do the Metacom project anyway as its own. This has already happened. My previous job was Providence Waterfront District, and that's exactly what happened. The issue there was contamination. Where all the tanks used to be, where all the old tanks had to be cleaned up, and the developers did a TIP program, and they got extra density for doing it, and the studio was involved in that as well, and we built the infrastructure and that there, and it's all different kinds of housing, all different choices of housing, and it really works, and it's not a burden on town.
So the check cleared.
What is it? The check cleared. What's that clear? No, I really do think that the Metacom is a great opportunity no matter what, because we do need housing, all kinds of housing. Not everyone wants to live in an apartment, not everyone wants to live there. We're one of the oldest states in the country.
So
we're leaving, and so we're going to need more transit because folks are not going to want.
So I mean, we could do Metacom independently, and kind of were focusing on that, but we just didn't think it was responsible to not address the other issue. I shared something with Kate. I got it last, like at 4:00, that Rhode Island is the second to worst state in the country for infrastructure right now. Well, we got beat by West Virginia. Four New England states are in bottom 10 for infrastructure. Connecticut and Massachusetts are not. Maine, New Hampshire, Vermont, and Rhode Island, but Rhode Island is 49th in the state for infrastructure. So, I mean, again, some of these things that we're talking about, Metacom and the TIP program, those are just exacerbating the problem. I mean, anyways. Yes.
I understood that the pavement and the development of the project would be permeable pavement and so forth. All of these kinds of things that should be taken into account. My question is, in relating to the idea of educating the public and getting the public to begin to be aware, if somebody like me who needs to fix the driveway needs to do that, do I just automatically go and put asphalt because that's what everybody does? Or am I nowadays, is somebody going to say to me, you cannot get a permit for asphalt, hopefully you probably get a permit, but that you need to do permeable pavement, especially if you want to increase it, because there's a lot more cars in my area.
Yeah, I mean,
I wanted to increase the driveway space to accommodate cars off the road.
Yes, you should do permeable.
Yes, I know. But I have people in my neighborhood who basically asphalted their
No,
road.
and part of the problem of that is that the town, I don't think any town is ready to take on that, to be an obligation for property owners. But unfortunately, the expense of permeable versus non-permeable is significantly more. And until there's some economies of scale, there's no incentive for you to do that. I mean, there's no program that's going to say, we're going to give you a rebate on something because you did the right thing if everyone else around you is doing the wrong thing. Again, I think it comes back to education. I mean, at some point, how do we control where this water goes? Or how do we slow it down?
Educating the public about a lot of things, and I think it would be good to have an environmental code all of the time, every week.
Yep.
So that these things could be introduced.
And I know that Rhode Island Public Radio has reinstated that they are going to have a dedicated environmental reporter who will be coming to my office tomorrow at 3:00. And she's actually, Sophia Rudin, she's done a number of pieces already on some of the things that we're doing with this project. But again, it's education, education, education. So I appreciate the fact that you recognize that. I wish I had a better answer for you that we could just mandate that people do that, but we're not there yet. Yep. Matt?
I know I already asked the question, but I have a friend, and he has this phrase, vision leaks. It's like a picture, just constantly falling up. One of the stunning things from here is you're not adding this to 2100, which is like, I don't think I'll be around, but the 2035 is 14 years away. So I guess I'm curious in terms of, this is a great forum, there are people online, but how does, and then there'll be a report that comes out September, December. Are there thoughts about how, if you're talking about environmental there's various avenues, but is there plans of keeping the vision going within the town? Like if there was this ubiquitous picture of what Market Street would look like in 2035, somewhere to capitalize on that. Keeping that picture.
We struggle with that. I mean, it's that, you know, we've had, I mean, this was 50% more people than we had at the first workshop. So we're like ecstatic, but that's kind of sad in some respects. I mean, we tried to take a lot of publicity, press releases. You know, we've sent everything to every media outlet in Rhode Island. Nobody's here. I don't think we're ever going to stop the message. I mean, you know, it's something that I talk about all the time ad nauseum, and it's probably people aren't here. But no, I mean, we have to keep reinforcing it because it's not going away. So, you know, hopefully you'll go tell a friend who will tell another friend. And I mean, but I don't know how we get that message out.
I think there is a way. And so, you know, Jacobs is out there on the Zoom world watching it, sticking with us as well. But Tim's fantastic, and Tim does work with Barrington, does work with Warren, is an engineer. But one of the things that she sort of brought me into with the work in Barrington is that Barrington has a energy and resilience committee that's part of town government. They're the nagging voice that's constantly there to the council. They're the nagging voice that's constantly there to the planning board. They're supporting the staff when they go out to go for grants and update different plans by being the resiliency voice, right? And I think, and I've seen this with other communities in Massachusetts, you need to, if this is an important priority for a community, you need to embed it in the decision-making structure. No, I am not. No, because I want to be, I'm serving as a consultant on projects. I don't want to muddy the water.
Just one more
But
item.
I think that idea of a standing group that is constantly sticking up for this. Bob's one person constantly sticking up for this, right? We're here for a while on this project, but it's got to have a group that owns it. And projects get done because somebody's passionate about them and they stick with it. And no offense to the council, they have a lot to do. But if you have a group that sticks with it, whether it's a nonprofit advocacy group or a committee that's part of government, you're going to build in some accountability and some consistency. That's my thought.
So Matthew, in the future, when you leave the planning board, you will be the chair of the resiliency.
I think you could be the connection on the planning board and still chair.
I mean, I think there are people on the planning board that, you know, are definitely engaged in this. I can't say that for every board, but I mean, we see the same players. I mean, and it's, you know, I guess the struggle is how do we engage other people? And I think we just have to keep doing that. I mean, we've talked about, you know, do we do like an infomercial? I mean, it's, you know, we don't know how to TikTok.
And the other thing is so I think we'll stick around. I want to let Paul get back to family and stuff. So I'm happy to stick around and answer questions, you know, sort of after we wrap things up officially on the record. You know, I don't know if any other sort of, you know, big questions that deserve the whole room, but I'm happy to stick around and keep talking.
Maybe one more thing. I know that in terms of incentivizing private owners to develop, I know that the form-based code are designed to go a long way to encourage that development, but it may be that the bottom line in terms of additional revenue from projecting development there may be cut. Is that possible? Because they'll need to be further incentivized to do those projects.
Well, I mean, giving density is incredibly strong currency. I mean, that's, you know, I mean, it's 20 years ago when I was in Arlington, Virginia, we did it. I mean, it's, that's real money. That's real currency. I mean, expedited approval process through the form-based code and additional density. I mean, that's, I don't think you need to do any more than that. I mean, and, you know, whether you gave additional density or not, you're still going to have the restrictions and requirements for stormwater and those are, so this kind of offsets what that additional expense is going to be. And we're in the process of approving an 18-unit apartment complex now on the Healy property. I mean, one of the things that the planning board was very stringent upon is what's stormwater control going to be. I mean, That's just a cost of doing business. But the additional density is really the carrot that brings people to the table. And my conversations with both the leasehold owner and the fee owner of the Job Lot Plaza, the first thing they said to me is, "You guys are going to do the zone change? I mean, we don't have to ask for that." I mean, so that's just indicative of what the value of that is. And that may not be readily noticeable to the layperson that doesn't do it, but if you tell somebody that you can do 70% more development than you thought you could, that translates into real dollars. Yeah, I mean,
these are the guidelines. You don't have to worry about, there's other issues. It's that.
So I think I brought it up the last meeting. I looked at Columbia Pike, which I led when I was in Virginia, and they adopted form-based code. They adopted TIF financing 20 years ago, and they are having projects approved in 6 months because somebody comes in, checks all the boxes for a form-based code, and away they go, versus 18 months.
They don't have to worry about ending up next to some monstrosity because it's in the form-based code that these are the guidelines that you have to follow.
And one of the things that we've done, and John has been participating in this and others, is we've formed a form-based code advisory board. So I mean, we've reached out to the community, said as we develop the form-based code, we want the community, when we're done, we want the community to say, this is what we came up with. So if there's objections, we can say, this is what, this wasn't the town, this was you. I mean, we're giving guidance, we're saying this is what we think it should be, but the community has an opportunity to be part of that, which doesn't always happen. Right.
I think it's totally about 15, the highest point. And our Facebook page has 110 people following. It's kind of amazing for just the project webpage.
Yeah, we're viral. I mean, if the election hadn't been stolen from us, we would really be. I meant for student council. So thank you all.
Thank you, guys.